Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really big question, one that's been around forever, the puzzle of free will. And now neuroscience is really in the thick of it, using its tools to look at how we actually make decisions.
Exactly. And it often challenges what we just, intuitively feel is happening.
Right. For ages, it was mainly philosophers debating this.
That's true. But the last few decades, it's been fascinating. Neuroscience is trying to map the actual biology behind our choices. Think of this deep dive as, well, your fast track to understanding this really complex area where mind meets brain.
Yeah, we'll unpack some key studies and, the ripple effects they've had.
Definitely some surprising moments ahead.
Okay, so our mission today is pretty clear. Explore how neuroscience has, well, challenged that traditional view of free will. We'll focus a lot on Benjamin Libet's work. It was really groundbreaking and how people are still interpreting it today.
Prepare for some potential aha moments, maybe even some that make you look at your own choices a bit differently.
And to do this right, we're looking at a mix of things.
Yeah, we've got the original neuroscience papers, philosophical critiques digging into the implications, and also some historical context, which is pretty crucial here.
Okay, let's dive in. Libet's 1983 experiments. They really kicked things off, didn't they? Can you walk us through what he actually did?
Sure. So Libet's setup in '83 was pretty ingenious for the time. He used EEG to measure brain activity and EMG to track muscle activity in the wrist.
Okay.
Participants were just told to flick their wrist spontaneously whenever they felt the urge. But the clever part was this special clock, like a fast-moving spot on a dial.
Ah, the clock. I remember reading about that.
Yes. They had to watch that spot and then report exactly when they first became consciously aware of their intention, their decision, really, to move. They'd note where the spot was at that moment. Libet called that the W judgment for will.
And the big finding, this is where it gets counterintuitive, right?
It really does.
Yeah.
The key finding was this specific brain signal, the readiness potential, or RP. It signals the brain preparing for movement. And Libet found it started building up around 550 milliseconds before people reported feeling that conscious intention to move. The W judgment, the conscious awareness, only came much later, maybe 200 milliseconds before the actual flick of the wrist.
Wait, so the brain's already getting ready to move like half a second before the person even feels like they've decided to move.
That's exactly it.
That really does challenge the basic idea that, I decide, and then my brain carries it out.
Precisely. Libet's first take was that unconscious brain processes actually initiate voluntary actions. Our conscious awareness just kind of catches up later. It directly questioned that sequence, we assume. Thought causes action. Maybe the brain acts before the I think part.
But Libet didn't entirely throw out conscious will, did he? Wasn't there something about a veto?
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
He introduced the idea of a conscious veto, or what he sometimes called free won't. He thought that even if the urge starts unconsciously, there's this little window, maybe the last 100 to 200 milliseconds before the muscle moves, where consciousness could step in and block the action, cancel it. And his participants did report sometimes feeling an urge, but then consciously stopping themselves.
Okay, so a stop button, basically.
Right.
And what did the EEG show then, when they vetoed?
Well, it's a bit tricky. If they just felt an urge and suppressed it without any muscle activity, the way the experiment was set up, an RP wasn't recorded because the trigger was the muscle signal.
Ah, okay.
But Libet also had people plan to act at a certain time and then consciously veto that plan just before acting. In those cases, a significant RP did show up before the veto.
So the brain was preparing even though the action got canceled.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It suggests the preparation was real even if stopped. Like you starting to say something and then catching yourself.
Right, okay. That makes sense. Now, Libet's work was huge, obviously, but controversial. Before we get into the critiques, though, let's bring in Daniel Wegner. His view was even more radical.
Yeah, Wegner took it further. He argued that our feeling of free will, that sense that I am doing this, is basically an illusion of conscious will.
An illusion? What?
Yeah. Wegner's idea was that our minds kind of construct this feeling. We see our thought, I'll lift my finger, followed closely by the action, the finger lifts, and we assume the thought caused the action. But he argued that might just be a story our mind tells itself after the fact.
So the feeling of willing it isn't actually what makes it happen.
That was his argument. He called it an epiphenomenalistic framework. Kind of like steam from a train. It's there, it's noticeable, but it's not driving the engine. The conscious feeling of will in this view is just an experience, not the cause. He did some clever experiments suggesting we can feel we willed things we didn't actually cause.
Okay, so both Libet, cautiously, and Wegner, more strongly, are pointing away from conscious will being the prime mover. But as you said, Libet's work faced pushback. What were the main issues people raised?
Oh, quite a few. Methodological concerns were big, a lot focused on the readiness potential itself. How reliable is it? How do we interpret it?
Like what specifically?
Well, one issue is potentially biased sampling. Because they analyzed the EEG after a movement occurred, they were only looking at brain activity that led to a movement. What if RPs sometimes happen but don't lead to movement? Those wouldn't get counted, right?
Right. So you might overestimate the connection between the RP and the action.
Exactly. If RPs pop up randomly sometimes, then finding one before an action doesn't necessarily mean it caused the action or even signaled the specific intention for that action.
What else?
Another thing is the signal itself. The RP is faint. You need to average many trials together to even see it clearly. And how you average it matters. You usually align the data to the muscle movement.
Okay.
But Aaron Scherger and others proposed a really interesting alternative. What if there's no specific decision signal like the RP? What if it's just random fluctuations in brain activity? Neural noise.
Random noise. How does that explain the RP shape?
Well, imagine baseline brain activity just drifting up and down randomly. In the Libet task, you're told to move whenever. Maybe the movement just happens when this random drift crosses a certain threshold by chance.
Yeah.
Now, if you take lots of these random drifts that happened to cross the threshold and led to a movement, and you average them all together, aligning them to the moment they cross the threshold, Scherger's model shows you get a curve that looks exactly like the readiness potential.
Wow. So the RP could just be an artifact of averaging random noise that happens to trigger an action.
It's a compelling possibility. It suggests the RP might not reflect a specific preparation or decision process starting 550 meters earlier, but rather the endpoint of a more random process in that specific uncued task. They even raised concerns about how baseline correction in EEG processing might create the appearance of an early onset RP.
That really changes the interpretation. What about later studies? Did they clarify things or just muddy the waters more?
Well, maybe a bit of both. Haggard and Eimer in '99 did find something interesting. They looked at the LRP, the lateralized readiness potential, which shows which hand is about to move.
Okay, more specific than the general RP.
Right. And they found the LRP onset time seemed to correlate better with the timing of conscious awareness, the W judgment, than the standard RP did. On trials where people reported earlier awareness, the LRP tended to start earlier too.
So maybe the LRP is closer to the conscious part.
That's one interpretation, yeah. It suggests different brain signals leading up to movement might relate differently to our conscious experience. The RP might be earlier, more general preparation, while the LRP is closer to the specific go signal for one hand, maybe linking more closely to awareness.
What about those fMRI studies?
Yeah.
Soon and his colleagues. They found activity even earlier, didn't they?
Yes. That was another big stir. Using fMRI, which measures blood flow changes related to brain activity, Soon et al. In 2008 reported they could predict which button someone would press. Get this, up to 7 seconds before the person reported consciously choosing.
7 seconds.
7 seconds. Using complex pattern analysis, MVPA, looking at activity in areas like the frontopolar cortex. It suggests that information predictive of the choice exists in the brain way, way before we feel we've made up our mind.
That's slightly terrifying, actually. But weren't those choices different from Libet's wrist flicks? More deliberate?
Good point. Yes, they often involved a bit more thinking, deciding between left or right button presses, without the same kind of spontaneous urge instruction as Libet. This highlights a key distinction. Proximal intentions, like the immediate urge to flick your wrist, versus more distal intentions, like deciding what to have for dinner later. Most of this early work is on proximal stuff. How it applies to bigger, more thought-out decisions is still debated.
Which brings us back to Scherger's model, the leaky stochastic accumulator. How does that fit with these different findings?
Scherger's model fits best with those spontaneous, self-initiated movements like Libet's. When there's no specific cue telling you when to move, the timing might just depend on when these random neural fluctuations happen to hit a threshold. The RP, then, isn't the decision signal itself, but what you see when you average those threshold-crossing moments.
Has anyone directly compared, say, arbitrary versus deliberate choices in the brain?
Yes, there was a study in 2019 that did just that. They found readiness potentials were pretty much absent for what they call deliberate decisions, like choosing which charity to donate to, but present for arbitrary decisions, like pressing a left or right button for no particular reason.
Interesting. So the type of decision really matters for the preceding brain activity.
It seems so. The neural lead-up might be quite different depending on whether a choice is driven by reasons and values versus just picking arbitrarily.
What about measuring awareness itself? Libet used the clock report, which is subjective. Any other approaches?
Yeah, Matsuhashi and Hallett in 2008 tried a different method. They basically used random auditory tones and asked people to veto their planned movement if a tone occurred before they felt their intention. By analyzing when people could successfully veto, they estimated the time of intention, T, without relying on the clock.
And what did they find?
Their results suggested that this time T, the point of awareness, might actually occur after the very beginning of the motor preparation process in the brain. Again, challenging the idea that awareness initiates the whole thing.
Okay, and the veto. Libet's escape hatch for free will. Any more recent work on that?
Kuhn and Brass looped into vetoing and found, well, more complexity. Their research suggests the decision to veto might also have unconscious roots. People weren't very good at telling the difference between actions they let happen impulsively and actions where they consciously decided not to veto.
So even the stop signal might not be fully conscious.
It seems the conscious experience of vetoing might not capture the whole underlying neural process. Maybe the veto itself gets initiated before we're fully aware of deciding to stop.
Right. So neuroscience seems to be painting this incredibly complex picture, far from just, I think, therefore I act. Where does this leave free will itself?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And part of the problem is free will means different things to different people. There's no single agreed-upon definition. Most of the studies we've talked about focus on these really simple, immediate actions.
Proximal intentions, you call them.
Right. But a lot of what we mean by free will involves more complex, long-term planning, reasoning, distal intentions. How much do these lab experiments on finger movements tell us about those kinds of choices? It's a big leap.
And some philosophers argue neuroscientists are maybe chasing a ghost, attacking an old-fashioned idea of free will.
That's definitely an argument you hear. Adina Roskies, for instance, basically says, look, neuroscience shows brain activity precedes decisions. If you're a materialist, if you think the mind is the brain, that's not surprising. Physical stuff happens before choices.
But others, like Haggard, seem more convinced by the data, saying, we feel we choose, but we don't.
Exactly. And philosophers like Al Mele or Walter Glannon point out that a lot of the neuroscientific arguments seem aimed at a kind of dualistic free will, a non-physical mind pulling the strings, which isn't the view most contemporary philosophers hold anyway.
So for these modern materialist philosophers, what does free will often mean then, if not a ghost in the machine?
Often it's framed in terms of things like control, reasons responsiveness, or the absence of coercion, like could you have done otherwise? Were you acting based on reasons you endorse? Even within that framework, the neuroscience findings still raise challenging questions.
Are there ways to make free will more scientifically testable, beyond just the timing of awareness?
People are trying. Lavassa and Ingles, for instance, talk about focusing on capacity. Can we measure an individual's capacity for things relevant to free will?
Like what kind of capacities?
Things like reasons responsiveness, can you understand reasons and act on them? Internal control, do you own the mechanisms driving your behavior? They suggest linking these to executive functions planning, impulse control, cognitive flexibility stuff we can measure with neuropsych tests.
Like the Stoop test or Wisconsin card sorting, things that measure cognitive control.
Exactly. Think about inhibitory control, the ability to stop an automatic response. That relates directly back to the veto concept, doesn't it? The idea is maybe we could develop a kind of free will index based on these measurable cognitive capacities.
So shifting the focus from did conscious thought start this specific movement to does this person have the general cognitive toolkit for reasoned, controlled action?
Precisely. It's about looking at the broader abilities needed for goal-directed behavior in the real world, which goes way beyond simple reflex. We know deficits in executive functions really impact people's ability to manage their lives.
You mentioned the marshmallow experiment earlier. That seems relevant here. Self-control.
Absolutely. The marshmallow test is all about delaying gratification, overriding an impulse for a later reward. That's a core executive function, part of self-control. It highlights how our behavior isn't just about immediate urges, but this complex capacity to regulate ourselves over time. Churchland and Suler even hypothesize about specific brain circuits and neurochemicals involved in self-control.
And our environment plays a role too, right? The idea of affordances.
Yes, Gibson's idea of affordances is key. Objects in our environment automatically suggest actions a handle affords grasping. Seeing it can unconsciously activate motor plans in the brain.
So we're constantly getting these unconscious nudges to act based on our surroundings.
Pretty much. And control in this sense is partly about our ability to manage these stimulus-driven impulses, to select which ones to act on and which to inhibit. Plus, researchers like Martin Seligman emphasize perspection, our ability to think about and be guided by future possibilities, not just reacting to the present or past.
Okay, this all inevitably leads to big questions about moral responsibility. If our conscious will isn't always the driver, how can we hold people responsible?
That's the really tough ethical knot, isn't it? If conscious will is an illusion, or even just less central than we thought, it shakes the foundations of responsibility, which usually assumes conscious agency.
Libet thought the veto saved responsibility, right?
He did. He argued that even if the urge starts unconsciously, we can be held responsible for consciously allowing it to proceed or for consciously vetoing it. Responsibility for the final choice to act or not act.
But as we discussed, even the veto might have unconscious precursors.
Exactly. That complicates Libet's neat solution. Some argue maybe even an unconsciously initiated veto is still us acting freely, but Libet rejected that. He felt conscious control was necessary for conscious responsibility. He compared actions without it to things like seizures not freely willed.
There's even research suggesting just believing you don't have free will can change behavior, right? Like making people more likely to cheat.
Yes, there have been studies suggesting that, though the findings are complex and debated, it hints that our beliefs about free will might matter, regardless of the underlying neuroscience.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. So, to wrap up, what are the main takeaways from all this? Libet, the critiques, the current state of play.
I think the core takeaway is that volition, the process of making decisions and acting, is much more complex than our everyday intuition tells us. Libet's work was pivotal in showing that measurable brain activity precedes our conscious feeling of deciding, launching decades of research and debate.
And that debate is clearly still very active.
Very much so. While Libet suggested the conscious veto offered a role for traditional free will, later research, alternative models like Scherger's, and studies on different types of decisions paint a more nuanced picture. The RP might not be what we initially thought, awareness might come later, and even the veto seems complex.
And the definition of free will itself is key.
Absolutely. Neuroscience often tackles simple, immediate actions. Philosophy grapples with broader concepts like reasons, control, and long-term agency. Trying to bridge that gap, maybe by focusing on measurable cognitive capacities linked to executive functions, seems a promising direction.
So the final thought for you, our listener. If our conscious experience of deciding isn't always the starting point, how does that change how you think about yourself, about your own choices and responsibilities?
It's a profound question. Does it change your sense of agency day to day? And what parts of free will is it the conscious feeling, the ability to act on reasons, the capacity for self-control? What parts truly matter to us? It's a conversation neuroscience has definitely reshaped, and it's far from finished.